Hello everyone. In the last episode, we were able to set up our socket server, and in this particular episode, I want us to work on our client where we'll be able to set up online users. And then in the next episode, we'll be able to show those online users on our UI. And the first thing that we will do is to set up a socket context at the root of the application. We will add a new folder and we'll call this one context. Right here, we'll add a new file and we'll say socket context.tsx. Then in here, we can set up a context. So we use context in React for global state, okay? We will export const socket context. We'll set this to be equal to create context, and this create context will come from React. I'll click this one that is from React and it will be auto imported. Then right here I will invoke, and we are supposed to have some default state. The default state in this case will just be null. So right here I'll say null, and we can define some types right here for this particular context. An interface which we'll define in a minute. So I'll say iSocket context, or it can be null. Let's define this iSocket context, I for interface. So here I'll just say interface and iSocket context. For now it can be empty, and then we'll be adding the types that we want to export from this particular context as we move on. Down here we will export a provider, export const socket context provider, and we'll set this to be an arrow function, and what we will return here is a component which will come from our socket context here. So it will be like this, socket context dot provider. So this is the component that we will export. So this will expect us to have a value. The type for this value is the one that we will be defining right here. So by default, right now, it's just an object. We don't have anything. Now, at the bottom here, I'll export a hook, which will help us to read our context. And I'll say export const use socket. This is a custom hook now, will be equal to an arrow function that basically will return our context. So we need to read the context, and this is how we do it. We say const context will be equal to, we make use of a hook from React called use context, and we pass our socket context, this one right here. And once we do this, this context will basically have this particular value. We check if it has a value. So we'll say if context is null, we will throw an error here, and we'll say throw new error, like that. We invoke that. So if we try to make use of this use socket in a component that is not wrapped with this particular provider, this is the error that we will get. So right here we go ahead and we return our context just like that. The next thing that we will do is to wrap our application with our socket provider. I'll come right here and I'll add a new folder at the root of the application, and I'll say provider or providers, and right here I'll add socket provider.tsx. We'll say use client. We'll create a stateless functional component, and we'll call this one socket provider. We will return socket context provider. It should come from our socket context. So control space, I import this from our socket context. We return this particular provider, which we defined right here, this one, and right here we'll pass children. These children will be able to get it right here as prop. So right here I'll say children, and right here I'll be able to define the type for this as React dot react node. Now this complains because we didn't accept any plop right here. So in this particular component, our socket context provider will be able to receive that children right here, and we can define the type as well of react node. I missed something at the front here, which is children full colon type react node. We receive the children, and then we wrap these children with this socket context provider. So right here I'll say children like that. I go ahead and save. The children will be the different components and pages in our application, which now will be able to access the values that we'll be able to define right here. So now to hook this up at our application, we need to go to our layout. So I'll go to layout, and we'll cover this main part right here with that particular socket provider. So right here I'll go ahead and say socket provider, and I can cover our main or wrap it with our socket provider. And once we do this, this main is the one that now will be passed as children right here. And every component that will be under this main, the navbar, the container, the children, which have the different pages, will now be able to access the values of our context. So now by doing this, we have already set up our context, and we can go ahead and start working on socket IO on our client side. The first thing that we will do is to initialize the socket on our client, and we'll make use of a library which is socket IO client. Add a terminal here and say npm I, and then you install socket.io-client, hit enter, and that will add socket IO for our client. And then in our socket context provider, just before our return statement, we can be able to define some states. So I'll say const socket, and then we will set socket. This will be equal to use state coming from React. We invoke that one, and it can be null. I can define the types, and I'll say the type for the socket will be socket, and this socket should come from our client side. Remember, we have this socket IO that is for our server, and then we have this socket IO client, so we use that one from client, or it can be null. So right here what we are doing is initializing a socket, and then I'll say use effect. We pass an arrow function. It will have some dependency array as well. Now right here I'll say const new socket will be equal to, we make use of a method called IO, which will come from our socket client, and then we will invoke it. And just by doing that, we have initialized a socket. And since we are using the same HTTP server for our Next.js app on the client and that of socket.io, we don't need to pass any URL right here. So right here we set our socket to be our new socket. In case this use effect runs again, we will be running a cleanup function so that we don't have many instances of our socket by returning this arrow function, and we'll say new socket dot disconnect. Whenever a user changes is when we will be able to run this use effect again, and we can get the user from our Clark auth. So right here I can say const user will be equal to use user, and this will come from Clark Next.js. That is a hook. Whenever this user changes, we'll be able to initialize a socket. Okay, we need to listen for connections and disconnections. I'll say const is connected, or you can say is socket connected. Set is socket connected to be equal to use state. By default, the value here will be false. We can now listen for connections and set up this is connected to true if we are connected. So right here I'll make use of another use effect we invoke it, we pass an arrow function, and at the end here I'll have some dependency array. This use effect will run again when socket status changes. Okay, and then right here I'll just first check if we have a socket. So do we have a socket? If socket is null, we will just return. We'll say if socket, our socket will have a property called connected. If socket is connected, you see we have connected and disconnected. If socket is connected, we will run a method here or a function which we will define called onConnect. And this onConnect will basically update our is socket connected status there. So onConnect, I invoke it. Okay, I'll go ahead and I'll define this onConnect function onConnect. Right here, I'll just say set is socket connected to true, like that. And then I'll also have another function which is on disconnect. On disconnect, I'll invoke that one, and here I'll set is socket connected to false. So if we are already connected, we'll directly call this particular function right here. But right here, I'll listen to some events. So whenever we connect to our server or disconnect, our socket IO will automatically emit those events, the connect and disconnect events, and then we can listen to those events here on the client. So I listen to the connect event, socket.on, and we listen to the connect event. So once we connect, we will run the onConnect function right here. And then we will also listen to socket.disconnect event. So on disconnect, and here we will basically run the onDisconnect function which we defined right there. So that way, this is socket connected will always tell us when we are connected to the socket or when we are disconnected to the socket. Here we have listened to these events, but then I will return a cleanup function. So I will return right here at the very bottom, and I will return this particular arrow function. And in here, I will disconnect from these particular events. So right here, I'll say socket.off, and I'll say connect, and then I'll say onConnect. I just stop listening to those particular events, and then I'll say socket.off disconnect, and right here on disconnect. So basically, whenever we run this particular use effect again, when socket changes, these will first clean up the events, and then we will listen to those events again. So that is basically what is happening. And we can log this to the console and see if it works. So once we connect our browser, we should see is socket connected as true. So console.log of is socket or is connected, just to make it shorter, and I'll say here is socket connected, and I'll go ahead and save that one. And also we can do this on our server. So at server.js, whenever we connect, this is where the code will run. So on the server, I can say console.log, and I'll say client connected. So when our client connects, the server will listen to this particular event, and it will be able to run this callback function here. Also, I'll remove this running from there, and I'll save. Our server is running, and right now you can see we don't have this console log client connected, but let's come to the client and we hit a refresh. So we can see this client connected is there, but our client is connected is false. So something is wrong, and this also is running over and over and over again. Our app is going crazy. We have many renders, and that is because of this particular use effect. This user keeps on changing, and therefore we get so many renders. This effect is on a continuous loop. I made a mess in this particular user. I should have destructured it from our use user. So include these curly brackets like that, and that should prevent this user from changing many times. Now here we'll be able to get our user which doesn't keep on changing, and therefore our app will run more smoothly. So what I'll do, I will refresh the client and then we see what happens. First of all, we get our console log here, client connected, like this, client connected. And then when it actually connect, it will update the state which is connected, and it will become true. We still have some re-renders, but at least it's not like continuous. And since we have events which will be changing the socket, the user, note that whenever you do a console log, you might face several re-renders. So when you see these, don't worry about it. Some people I see, they freak out when they see many console logs, which is totally normal with React because of the re-renders. Okay, so what I'll do now, I can just remove this console log, and we can be able to set up online users now that our client is being connected to our server. And this is not like things that I have come up with. Some of this is actually on the Socket.io documentation. So if you feel lost, you can just go to Socket.io, then you check for next docs, how to use with Next.js. The docs that we were still going through in the last episode, I'll still leave a link to it at the description section below. So if you scroll down, you'll see that we have a client guide on how you can connect your client, and you'll see some of these is from there, like this particular use effect. You can see we are listening to the connect event, the disconnect. We are running on connect and on disconnect, which are these particular functions. And then whenever we are connected, we are running on connect. So kind of similar thing, okay? But now from there, there is no more guide on Socket.io, so we'll continue from there. And I want us to set up the online users. First of all, I think we can start on the server. So I'll come to the server here, and after our IO here, I'll set up a variable, and I'll say let online users be equal to an empty array. And then right here, whenever we have a connection, we will have this callback function with a socket, and we can make use of this socket to listen to events. So right here, I will listen to an event that will come from client. I'll say add user, and right here I'll say socket.on. I'll invoke that, listen to an event called add new user. So we will fire this event from the client and we listen it here on our socket server. So if we get this particular event, we'll be able to get back a Clark user. So we'll get a Clark user from our client, and then right here we'll be able to do some stuff and add that user to these particular online users. First of all, we can check, does this Clark user exist at our online users? And if the user does not exist, we will basically add the user. So I'll say, do we have Clark user to begin with? And if we have, we check if this user exists. So we'll say online users dot sum. Here we'll get a user at a time, and then we return here. We check if this user that we get dot user ID is the same as this Clark user. So we'll say it's the same as Clark user dot ID. That means that that user already exists, okay? But we want the case where the user does not exist. So here just include an exclamation mark. So basically, if we have a Clark user and this Clark user does not exist on our online users, we will go ahead here. So I'll say end and add that Clark user to our online users. So right here I'll say online users dot push. I invoke that and I pass the online user that we want to push, which is our Clark user. First of all, I'll say the user ID here is our Clark user dot ID. I'll use a comma. I'll set up the socket ID for this particular user, and we'll say socket.id. So this socket ID is very important because we can fire events to a specific user. For example, whenever we initialize a call, whenever we call a user, we'll use that socket ID to only make a notification to them only, not everyone, okay? So these socket IDs are pretty important. Let's spell everything right here. Socket, and then here ID to be socket ID. And then right here, I'll include every other details about the user because we might need to show the profile, username or profile picture and so on. So here I'll say profile is our crack user, just like that. Once we add them at the end here, still inside our socket.on, at the end here, once we add them, we can emit an event that we have added an online user. So we emit to everyone who is online that we have a new user, so that they'll show on the UI. So right here I'll say io.emit. So we use io on our server to emit events. So I'll say io.emit, and we'll say get users. So we emit this particular event, and we will emit our online users. So we emit those users to our client. Now on our client, we will be able to listen to these get users, and we get our online users from the server. Very nice. I hope it's not confusing. Now this is adding a user whenever we connect. Now there are cases where we will disconnect, okay? So we need to remove a user whenever we disconnect. So still in our io.on, after our socket.on, we'll come right here and we'll say socket.on, and we will listen to the disconnect event. So whenever a client disconnect or a user disconnect, we will be able to remove those users from our online users. So right here, disconnect, and we'll do it like that. We return an arrow function. In this particular arrow function, we will filter out our online users. Right here, I'll say online users will be equal to, remember we had defined this as a variable using let, will be equal to, so we are updating it, online users dot filter. Then we invoke this one. We will get a user at a time, and we will be able to return those users whom user dot socket ID is not equal to our socket.id. So we make use of the socket ID to remove the user who disconnected from our online users, and then we emit back get users again. So right here I'll copy this and I'll paste there. So if we disconnect, this will automatically update the client that we have updated our online users, and we get the new list of the online users. So here we are sending the active users. Send active users, and that is our comment there. Again, here we are only sending the active users, just like that. Okay, very nice. Now let's work on the client and see how this will work out. We go to our socket context. In our socket context, we will start by setting up some state right here, and we'll say const online users, and we will set online users to be equal to use state. We invoke that. By default it will be null. We will say the type will be socket user, and that will be an array of socket user, or it will be null. We need to define this particular type, so we can create a folder for the different types. So right here I'll add a new folder, and I'll say types, and right here I'll add a new file, and I can say index.ts. I'll export a type. So export type socket user, which will be equal to, our socket user have a user ID which is a string, then we have a socket ID which is also a string, then we have a profile. The profile will be of type user. User will come from our Clark Next.js, so user type. So we define that type socket user. We come back to our socket context and we import that socket user right here. So that will be the type of our online users. Now we come down here after this use effect. I'll define another use effect. In this particular use effect, we will set online users. Use effect, we pass an arrow function, expects us to have a dependency array. The dependencies here will be when socket changes, when is socket connected changes, and when user changes. We will be able to run this particular use effect. So right here, we'll first check if we don't have a socket, or if we are not connected, is connected. Okay, is socket connected? We will return. And then right here, we can emit an event to add a user. So we'll say socket.emit, and we will invoke that. The event that we will emit is the one that we listen to right here, add user. So we emit the event on the client, then we will resend it right here. So we emit the event add new user. Then right here, we will just pass our user. Once we do this, this user will be received right here as our Clark user, and then we'll be able to add that Clark user to the list of our online users. And then once we add from the server, we will emit get users. So once we emit get users on the server, we will pass the online users together with that event, and we can resend to these get users on the client. So on our client, here we have emitted add users, but now here we will listen to get users. So I'll say socket.on, we listen to get users. This event is the one that is fired by the server, and right here we will get back a response. This response is the online users, and here what I want to do is to run an arrow function, and we will be able to set our online users to be this response, and that response again is our online users that we get from our server. Now right here we will run a cleanup function. So I'll say return, and right here I will run an arrow function, and we will clean up the listening of this particular event. So for a meeting, we are not cleaning that one up. Where we are listening is the one that we are cleaning it up. So right here I'll say socket.off. Whenever we run this use effect again, before we run this cleanup function is the one that we run first to clean up the previous listening of events. And here what we will clean up is get users. Basically we will clean up this. So I can copy that and I'll paste it right here, and I'll save. And as you can see, it's pretty easy. We emit the event to our server listens to the event, gets the user, and add that user to our online users. Then it emits this particular event, and we will be able to listen to get users on our client, and we set that to our state. Then whenever we disconnect, our server will automatically detect that we have disconnected. So it will automatically detect a disconnect, and then we will filter out the user using the socket ID. The socket that have disconnected, we will remove that user from our online users, and then we will emit the new list of online users to the other users. Okay, so we are emitting to everyone. Whenever we get to a situation where we emit to a specific person, you'll see how we do that. But for now, we are doing that for everyone. Now, this should work, and if we have issues, we'll fix them. But if we try to console log online users, we should get something. So console.log of online users, and right here I'll say online users. So let's see what we get, and I save. Now I come to our client. Our client is the browser, and let's refresh this page and see if we get anything. So sometimes our Clark user delays to show, our online users are null, so something is wrong. Okay, actually I see here I'm emitting add new users. It should be add new user, because that is what we are listening to here, add new user. So that S might be messing things up, and let's try this again. I don't know if it resolves the issue, but let's see. I will refresh, and I'll inspect here, and as you can see, it starts off as null, but once the event is emitted and then we get back the get users, we are able to see that we have a user added here. Okay, again, don't worry about the many console log, especially because we are working with events here. The socket, the status of online users, all that will keep changing. That's why we see many console log. This is cool. We have added one user. Maybe we can try to log into our application using another account and see if we will be able to add this user. So what we can do, I'll copy this link and I'll open a private tab or another browser. You can use another browser or open a different private tab, and you run the app there. So here I am on a different browser, and yeah, now let's sign in here. This is a new user trying to sign in. So here I logged in with another profile. I signed up for another profile and logged in, and now as you can see, this automatically added that user as an online user on this other one, and you can see now we have two online users, which is pretty nice. They have different socket ID and different IDs, and also for this one we should now be able to also see that we have two online users. So if I console log here, you'll see here we have two online users as well, this one and this one. So this is working very, very nice, and this is what we can do to set up our online users using Socket.io. And now in the next episode, we'll just take those online users and we'll be able to show them on the UI. So I'll see you on the next one.